Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be in English because a lot of my subscribers do not understand Hindi and they've requested for tutorials in English. So today's video is going to be a tutorial of a beautiful landscape using a lot of earth colors like burnt umber and burnt sienna. And I've also used a color called mauve, which I recently got and I'm absolutely loving it. So this is going to be a step-by-step tutorial and I hope you like it. So let's begin. Before we start the tutorial, let's have a look at the materials. So I've already finished the drawing, and for all the people who need the reference image for the drawing, they could always join my Facebook group called Art by Shivangi. It's a closed group, so you'll have to send me an invitation. There I post step-by-step photos of all the videos I've done so far. So what I'm going to do is with my 1-inch flat brush, I'm going to wet the paper and I'm going to wet it till the horizon line. We want to make sure that all the area is nicely covered, but you also want to make sure you don't want to overly saturate the paper with water. Otherwise it's going to take a little more to dry. It'll be difficult to control the watercolor. I made another video on this. Now that my sky area is wet, I'm going to put something below my board so that we have the board at an angle. So what that's basically going to do is going to help the paint flow. Now I'm going to start painting. I've used a light mix of the color mauve, and as you all know, I like to use light circular motions just because it looks really soft and I would like to avoid harsh lines. So I'm going to take my round brush number 6 and I'm going to start applying color. Please observe that the paper is still wet. That is how I'm getting that soft wet in wet look. Once the lighter tones are done, you can start adding slightly darker tones, but you don't want to completely cover your paper with it, just here and there. Now I'm going to start painting the pathway. So first what we're going to do is we're going to wet that entire area. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to start adding burnt sienna. So I want to try adding darker tones to the area closer to me, and I want to add lighter tones to the area farther away. That's how we give that feel of distance. So here's a tip for you. If you ever feel like you've darkened an area too much, you can always use a tissue to lift out excess paint, but you have to make sure you have to do it while it's still wet, otherwise nothing's going to happen. Alright, now that our pathway is dry, we're going to start painting the foliage area to the right hand side. So I'm going to first give it the base color of yellow ochre. I'm going to completely cover that area with a thin layer of yellow ochre. Alright, so my first layer is done and now we're gonna have some fun. Whoa, that rhymed. Anyway, so we're gonna use burnt sienna now, and I'm adding a darker mix. You can see how it's blending in so beautifully because we're doing wet and wet again, and you want to create that angle as if the foliage area is sloping downward. So you want to make sure that whenever you're painting, try to use that angle and not use straight lines. It gives that effect of a sloping area. There on the horizon line, I'm also adding more burnt sienna. Basically what you want to do is play around with the tones and do it till you're satisfied. You don't have to follow exactly the way I'm doing it, so there's no harm in that either. I'm going to load my brush with burnt sienna. I'm going to cover my hand so that the rest of the painting doesn't get spoiled. And I'm going to tap my paintbrush slightly just so that those little dots fall here and there, and it gives a natural look. So basically on the left hand side, I'm going to repeat exactly what we did on the right. We're going to give a base layer of yellow ochre, and then once that's down, we're going to add burnt sienna tones on top of it. Try to add thicker, thickest, and use that progression, and you can do it till you're satisfied. Now at the bottom, I'm going to add a very dark mix of burnt sienna. I've created it by adding a little bit of cobalt blue. Now we'll start painting the background trees. For this, I've used a mix of burnt sienna and mauve. Make sure that you use a very light mix for this. You want the background trees to look really light as compared to the trees in the foreground. I'm using my silver round brush for this. Because of the pointed tip, I'm able to branch out the branches from thick to thin. Make sure that the branches are always thick to thin. At the very center at the horizon, I'm going to give an idea of a piece of land. So for that, I'm going to use a very light mix of mauve. And on top of that, I'm going to add more trees with the lightest mauve shade. Now just like I did on the right hand side, I'm going to repeat the same effect on the left hand side and finish the trees to the left. Alright, so now that our trees are done, we're going to start adding leaves. For this, I'm going to use my favorite bristle brush. And if you've taken my course on YouTube before, you know that this is my favorite way of painting trees. So the first thing I'm going to do is do an underpainting of yellow ochre. I'm going to lightly tap my bristle brush. Now once the yellow ochre layer is dry, I'm going to start adding darker tones of burnt sienna. You want to take your time for this, you really don't want to rush it, and make sure that the paint that you use for this is really thick. A lot of my subscribers have told me that their trees turned out a little messy than mine, and that is basically because maybe you're using a lot of water. If you're using a lot of water, the bristle effect will not come, so try to use thick paint for this. Now let's add the third and the darkest tone, which is a mix of burnt sienna and cobalt blue. Now I'm using my round brush, and with the fine tip I'm going to add a few leaves where I feel there are empty spots. It also gives a very natural look and it can be controlled. With the bristle brush, maybe it can't be as controlled. So towards the outer side of the foliage, I'm going to add little dots here and there. And now we're going to start making the branches. For this, I'm using a very thick mix of burnt sienna and cobalt blue. One thing to note about earth colors like burnt sienna and burnt umber are that they tend to become lighter after drying. So if you can see right now, in contrast with the tray, my foreground is looking a little lighter. So here I'm going to do a technique called glazing, where I'm just going to add a layer of burnt sienna on top of the ground, just so that our ground deepens up a little bit and complements the tree to the left. I'm going to repeat the same thing on the left hand side. No painting is complete without adding shadows. So now let's start adding shadows to the pathway, which is going to accentuate the light and the dark areas. Shadow color can be made by mixing crimson lake, cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Alright, so I'm finally done with my shadow and I'm happy with the way it looks. Now I'm going to start adding the effect of grass at the bottom. So for this I'm using my round 6 number 6 brush. It has a good pointed tip. If you don't have a good round brush, you could always use a rigger brush. Rigger brush is actually ideal for painting grass. So here I've used a very thick mix of burnt sienna and cobalt blue. I'm going to do the same thing on the right hand side. Okay, so here's the finished painting. I think it looks wonderful and I think it looks so different from the usual color schemes that we get to see, and I can't wait for you to try it. Please let me know in the comments below how it turned out, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye and thank you so much.